I bought an old farm at auction for $150 when demolishing a wall workers found an iron door. Behind it was an underground vault with $900,000 and an old diary. When I opened the first page, I lost my breath. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. Life before was ordinary, almost painfully so. In the spring of 2023, I was 44 years old, freshly divorced, and living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, that cost me more per month than I care to admit. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at that point in my life, I was what you might charitably call between chapters. What I called it, in the quieter moments, was lost. The divorce from Daniel had been finalized 8 months earlier after 12 years of marriage. There were no children, which people always said made things simpler, though I'm not sure simpler is the same as easier. I had given up my job at an insurance firm to support his career, followed him through 2 state moves, and watched 12 years of my life get distributed between 2 lawyers at roughly $400 an hour. In the end, I walked away with my car, my grandmother's china, and just under $22,000 in a savings account, which in Columbus, Ohio, feels like a lot right up until the moment it doesn't. I was working part-time at a title company by then, reviewing property records. Ironic in retrospect. It was a colleague named Donna who first showed me the county auction listing. She dropped a printed sheet on my desk one Thursday afternoon like it was junk mail. "Tax delinquent properties," she said. "Bidding starts this weekend. Some of them go for next to nothing." I almost didn't look at it, but I did. The listing that caught my eye was a 12-acre parcel in rural Morrow County, about an hour north of Columbus, outside a small town called Cardington. The property included a farmhouse built in 1912, 2 outbuildings, and a collapsed barn. It had been assessed years ago at $87,000, though the assessment was clearly generous. The photographs showed a gray, exhausted structure with boarded windows and a sagging porch. The starting bid was $150. $150. I sat with that number for an entire evening, turning it over in my mind the way you turn a strange coin in your fingers. I told myself I was being impulsive. I told myself I knew nothing about farming, nothing about old houses, nothing about what I was getting into. All of that was true. I bid anyway, online, at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday with a glass of cheap wine beside my laptop, and by Saturday morning I owned a farm. The drive out to Cardington felt surreal. I passed flat fields, grain elevators, and churches with hand-painted signs, and all of it looked like a country I had never quite visited before. When I pulled up to the property on a cool April morning, the reality of what I had done settled onto my shoulders like something heavy and shapeless. The farmhouse was worse in person. The porch boards were soft underfoot. A family of starlings had taken up residence in what had once been the parlor. The kitchen ceiling had partially collapsed from a water leak that must have gone unaddressed for years. But the bones were there. Anyone who grew up watching renovation shows knows that phrase. The bones are good. And I had watched enough of them to believe it. I walked through every room with a flashlight and a legal pad, making notes, trying to see past the ruin to something worth saving. It took me 2 weeks to find local contractors willing to work within my budget. I hired 3-day laborers through a handyman named Ray Perkins, a quiet, reliable man in his 60s who had grown up in Cardington and seemed to know the history of every building in the county. "This was the Whitmore place," he said on his first day, running a hand along the doorframe of the parlor. "Harold Whitmore. He passed maybe 6-7 years back. No one's touched it since." I filed that information away and didn't think much about it at the time. I should have. 3 weeks into the work, Ray's crew began demolishing the interior wall between the kitchen and what had once been a back storage room. An ugly wall, clearly added sometime in the 1950s, covered in dark paneling that had buckled from years of humidity. I was standing in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee when one of the younger laborers, a kid named Marcus, stopped mid-swing with his pry bar. "Hey, Miss Mitchell," he called out, "you're going to want to come look at this." The paneling had peeled back to reveal a section of older wall beneath, and in that wall, set flush and nearly invisible until the surrounding material was stripped away, was a door. Iron. Heavy gauge with a lever-style handle and a keyhole below it. It was perhaps 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall, sealed into what looked like a reinforced concrete frame. None of us spoke for a long moment. I set my coffee down on the windowsill. My hands, I noticed, were not quite steady. "Did anyone know this was here?" I asked. Ray shook his head slowly. "Not that I ever heard of," he said. The lock had rusted and gave way after 20 minutes with a drill and a chisel. What lay behind it was a staircase, narrow, concrete, descending into darkness. I borrowed Marcus's flashlight and went down alone. At the bottom of those stairs, I found shelves. On the shelves were stacks of currency, banded and wrapped in waxed cloth, arranged with the deliberate care of someone who intended the money to last. And behind the shelves, pushed against the far wall in a wooden crate, was a leather-bound journal. Old, its cover dark with age. I didn't open it. Not yet. I stood in that sealed room and stared at what a dead man had hidden, and I could not breathe. What would you do, standing in a place like that, with the world above you carrying on as if nothing had changed? I climbed back up the stairs. I thanked Ray and Marcus, and then, alone in Harold Whitmore's kitchen, with a flashlight in my hand and a heart that had not yet found its rhythm again, I began to understand that my life had just divided itself into a before and an after. The room at the bottom of the stairs was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, with concrete walls and a low ceiling that forced me to duck slightly at the base of the steps. The air was cool and dry, the way old cellars sometimes are when they have been sealed against the weather for years. I had gone back down alone the following morning, after sending Ray and his crew to work on the exterior, and I stood among those banded stacks with a legal pad and a pen, and I made myself count. It took the rest of that morning and most of the afternoon. The bills were mostly 50s and 100s, some older series, some as recent as the late 1990s. A portion had deteriorated where the waxed cloth hadn't sealed tightly, but the majority were intact. I counted them twice. Once at the kitchen table, once again in the morning after I had slept fitfully on the bare floor in my sleeping bag, because I couldn't bring myself to leave the property. When I finished the second count, the number was the same both times, $914,000. I sat with that number, the way you sit with a sentence that doesn't make sense, reading it again, expecting it to change, finding that it doesn't. I had spent most of my adult life working in a world of policy limits and liability assessments, and I understood instinctively that money of this amount, found in a sealed room beneath a property I had purchased at a tax auction, was not simply mine to pocket. It would require reporting. It would require documentation. It would require a lawyer, preferably a very good one. But before any of that, I read the diary. I opened the oilcloth on Harold's kitchen table in the thin April light of that second morning, and I began at the first page. The handwriting was careful and slanted, the hand of a man who had been taught penmanship in an era when that still mattered. The entries were not consistently dated, but from context I gathered they spanned the last decade of Harold Whitmore's life. Harold, I came to understand, had been a widower, a farmer, and a profoundly private man who had not trusted banks since a close friend lost everything in a savings and loan collapse in the 1980s. He had accumulated the money over decades, some from farming, some from rental income on a neighboring parcel he'd sold in the late 90s, and he had hidden it deliberately, certain that the formal financial system would fail him the way it had failed others. But the most important entries were not about the money itself. They were about his family. Harold had 2 living relatives by the time he died, his nephew Gerald Whitmore, who lived in Dayton, and Gerald's sister Pamela Cross, who lived in the same county. The entries described both of them with a quiet, unflinching clarity that I recognized as the writing of a man who had stopped pretending. Gerald had visited repeatedly in Harold's last years, always friendly, always helpful, always asking questions about the property and its value. Pamela had filed papers. Harold mentioned this directly, attempting to have Harold declared mentally incompetent so she could assume guardianship of his estate. The attempt had failed, but it had cost Harold months of anxiety and his own legal fees. "They know there is something here," Harold wrote in one of the later entries, "or they suspect it. I do not intend to let them have it. They would waste it in a year and feel entitled to every cent. I have thought about what to do with it for a long time. I have no answer that satisfies me, so I leave it where it is and let Providence decide." I read those words 3 times. Is this what Harold had intended? For someone to find it? Someone who hadn't known him, hadn't expected anything, hadn't spent years circling him like something patient and hungry? I couldn't know, but I knew what I intended, and I knew I had to be careful about how I moved. The whisper came that evening in the quiet of the empty house, the whisper that said I could simply take the money, quietly, transfer it somewhere, and no one would ever be the wiser. The workers had not seen what was inside the room. Ray had not come down the stairs. I was alone with this knowledge, and that kind of aloneness can make certain thoughts feel reasonable that have no business feeling that way. I want to be honest about that whisper. It was there. I heard it clearly. I chose not to listen to it, not because I was afraid of being caught, but because Harold Whitmore's words were still in my head, and they had created in me a sense of accountability I did not ask for and could not set down. He had trusted Providence. I intended to be worth that trust. So I made a plan, 3 parts, simple and sequential. First, call Diane. Diane Chen had been my closest friend since our sophomore year at Ohio State, and in the 20-something years since, She had built a reputation in Cleveland as a meticulous property attorney who did not bluff and did not blink. I called her that evening and spoke in generalities at first. I'd found something on the property, something valuable, something complicated, until she told me plainly that I needed to tell her exactly what I was dealing with. So I did. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Okay," Diane said finally, "don't touch anything else. Don't tell anyone. And come to my office Monday morning. We need to talk about this before you make a single move. Second, let Diane guide me through the reporting process. Whatever was legally required, I would do it, fully, transparently, without hesitation. Third, use the diary. I didn't yet know exactly how or in what form, but I understood, with a bone-deep certainty that comes from reading a man's private words in the house where he lived, that the diary was the most important thing in that room. More important than the money. The money was evidence of what Harold had done. The diary was evidence of why. I agreed to Diane's Monday. I lay down on my sleeping bag in Harold Whitmore's kitchen and looked at the ceiling in the dark and listened to the old house settle around me. Whatever was coming, I thought. At least I was going toward it with my eyes open. Diane Chen's office in Cleveland was on the 14th floor of a building that looked over Lake Erie, gray and enormous in the April morning. She had cleared her schedule for me. When I walked in with the diary under my arm and a manila folder of photographs I'd taken of the sealed room, she looked at everything carefully and in silence before she said a word. "In Ohio," she said at last, "money found on property you legally own is generally considered yours. But it's not automatic, and it's not clean if there are potential claimants with a colorable argument. Harold Whitmore died without a will on record, which means his estate may not have been properly settled." "Does that affect the sale?" I asked. "It could complicate it. Tax lien sales are supposed to clear title, but if the estate was never probated and there are heirs who weren't properly notified," she tapped her pen, "it gets layered. The first thing you need to do is report the fine to the county sheriff's office, formally, today." I had expected her to say that. I had spent the entire weekend arguing with myself about it. The whisper again, quieter now but still there, suggesting that reporting it was the one unnecessary step, the one place where caution could be traded for advantage. I had made my peace with the answer. Reporting was not a risk. It was the only road I was willing to walk. We drove to the Morrow County Sheriff's Office together that same afternoon. I brought the photographs, the diary, and my deed to the property. The deputy on duty, a young man named Henderson who looked mildly astonished throughout our conversation, documented everything and called in his supervisor, a sheriff named Dale Cook, who was considerably less astonished and considerably more deliberate. "You understand," Sheriff Cook said, "that we'll need to secure the property and inventory the room, and we'll need to notify the county prosecutor's office." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm here." They sealed the lower room that same day. A deputy followed me back to Cardington and documented the door, the staircase, the shelves, and what remained on them. A team from the prosecutor's office arrived 2 days later with a certified accountant, and the official count, done carefully, bill by bill, over the course of an entire afternoon, came to $914,200. The report became public record within a week. In rural Morrow County, that was approximately the same as broadcasting it on every radio station in the state. I first heard Gerald Whitmore's name spoken in a new context on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after I'd filed the report. Ray Perkins called me, not as my contractor, but in the quiet, careful way of a man who felt he owed me a warning. "Gerald Whitmore called me last night," Ray said. "Asked me about the work we'd done on the property. Asked what we'd found." "What did you tell him?" I told him I didn't know anything beyond what was in the papers. A pause. "Sarah, he wasn't friendly about it. You should know that." 2 days later, a cream-colored envelope arrived with a law firm letterhead I didn't recognize. Stratton and Burke, Dayton, Ohio. The letter informed me, in careful legal language, that Gerald Whitmore and Pamela Cross, as the sole surviving heirs of Harold Whitmore, were asserting a claim to all personal property belonging to their late uncle's estate, including but not limited to funds discovered at the Whitmore family property in Morrow County. They formally requested that I cease any efforts to claim ownership of said funds and cooperate with the return of said property to the rightful heirs. I read the letter twice. Then I called Diane. "They moved fast," she said. "Is their claim valid?" "It's an argument," she said. "Whether it's a valid one is what we're going to spend the next several months proving it isn't. The key is the tax sale and the diary. But Sarah—" She stopped. "They're going to put pressure on you. People like this don't just send lawyers. Be prepared for that." I put the phone down and stood in Harold's kitchen, looking out at the April fields going green in the distance. Was I ready for whatever was coming? I thought about Harold Whitmore, writing in his diary by lamplight, listening to his family circle him like something patient and hungry. He had held on. He had not let them have what he had built. I decided I could do the same. Diane moved quickly once the Whitmore letter arrived. She filed a formal response on my behalf within 4 days, asserting my clear title to the property under Ohio's tax lien, sale statutes, and arguing that funds concealed within a property at the time of its legal transfer constituted a fixture of the estate, legally part of what I had purchased. It was a strong argument. It was not, however, airtight, and both Diane and I knew it. My plan, as we developed it over several phone calls and one long evening at her kitchen table in Cleveland, had 3 components. First, establish the validity of my title through county records, the full documentation of the original tax delinquency proceeding, and the auction. Second, use the diary to demonstrate Harold's state of mind and his deliberate concealment, not as proof of inheritance, but as context for why the money had never been declared or probated as part of his estate. Third, if necessary, argue that since the estate had never been properly probated, Gerald and Pamela had no standing as heirs to an estate that had been legally extinguished through the tax proceedings. Diane retained a forensic accountant to verify the bill series and dates on the currency, which would help establish when the money had been accumulated. She also hired a certified handwriting analyst to authenticate the diary. I paid for this from my savings. Nearly $7,000 gone in the first month, which left me increasingly aware that this fight had a financial ceiling I was approaching faster than I had anticipated. The Whitmore family, meanwhile, was not patient. It started with phone calls. Gerald Whitmore called my cell phone on a Tuesday evening. I still don't know how he got the number, and his voice was smooth, practiced, and absolutely clear in its intent. "Miss Mitchell, I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd like to talk person to person about finding a resolution that works for everyone." "I filed my response through counsel," I said. "Any communication should go through my attorney." "That's a shame," he said, "because once we get lawyers involved, things tend to get expensive and complicated, and I'd hate to see you spend your savings on a fight you're unlikely to win." I thanked him and ended the call. I sat in the farmhouse kitchen for a long time afterward, hands flat on the table, breathing slowly. Was he bluffing? Was his case stronger than Diane believed? I did not sleep well that night. The escalation came the following week. A car I didn't recognize, a dark gray sedan, parked at the end of my driveway for 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon. I photographed it from the porch. The plate came back registered to a private investigator in Dayton. I forwarded the photograph to Diane. Then came Pamela Cross. She arrived at the property without warning on a Thursday morning, while Ray's crew was working on the exterior siding. She was 61, small, impeccably dressed for a rural property visit, and she stood at the edge of my porch with the composed expression of a woman who had decided to try a different approach. "I just wanted to see the place," she said. "I grew up coming here. Uncle Harold used to make lemonade on this very porch." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said. "You'll understand that. Given the legal proceedings, I can't discuss the property with you directly." "The legal proceedings." She smiled thin and tight. "You know, Harold was not a well man in his final years. The things people convince themselves of when they're alone and afraid, it can lead to all sorts of strange decisions." Was she planting seeds for a mental competency argument, the same one she had tried to use against Harold while he was alive? "Goodbye, Miss Cross," I said. She left, but as she walked back to her car, a different gray sedan, which I also photographed, she turned and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as certain. Not angry, certain. As if she already knew how this story ended. That certainty rattled me more than anything Gerald had said on the phone. I called Diane from the porch and described both visits. Diane took notes and told me to document everything. "They're trying to wear you down, Sarah. That's what this is. They don't have a strong case and they know it. What they have is the expectation that eventually you'll find this too expensive, too exhausting, and too frightening to continue." For the next 4 days, I gave myself permission to step back. I drove to Lake Erie, rented a small cabin outside Huron, and did nothing of consequence. I walked on the beach in the cold air and ate bad clam chowder at a diner off the highway and slept 9 hours a night. I didn't check email. I didn't call anyone except Diane, briefly to tell her I was taking a few days. I let myself feel the fear properly, really feel it all the way through. And then I let it sit there quietly, the way you let a storm pass. By the 4th morning, the fear had lost most of its power over me. I drove back to Cardington on a Sunday. The county road was empty in the early light. The fields on either side were pale green and very flat, and above them the sky was enormous, the way Midwestern skies are, full of weather and distance. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness exactly, steadiness. That was enough. The offer came in writing through Stratton and Burke on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after I had returned from the lake. The letter proposed what it called a negotiated settlement, in which I would receive $75,000 from the recovered funds as a finder's fee, with the remainder to be turned over to Gerald Whitmore and Pamela Cross as the acknowledged heirs of Harold Whitmore's estate. The letter was 4 pages long and used the phrase "equitable resolution" 7 times. It also, buried in the second-to-last paragraph, included a sentence that I read twice to make sure I had understood it correctly. Acceptance of this offer would require me to surrender the diary and all copies to the Whitmore family. I called Diane the moment I finished reading. "They want the diary," I said. A brief silence. Then, "Of course they do." The diary was the pivot point of everything. Without it, I was simply a property buyer who had found money in a wall. Sympathetic, perhaps, but legally exposed. With it, I had Harold's own words describing his family's attempts to exploit him, his deliberate choice to hide the money, and his clear preference that they not receive it. The diary didn't constitute a will, but it gave a court a picture of Harold Whitmore that was the opposite of the devoted family man the Whitmores would try to present. "What do I say?" I asked. "Nothing yet," Diane said. "Let me review the offer formally. But Sarah, this tells us something important. They're scared of that diary." I declined the settlement. Gerald called again that evening, unscheduled, his smooth voice just slightly less smooth than before. $75,000 is a generous offer, Ms. Mitchell. More than generous. This property sold for $150. I'm sure you appreciate the difference." "I do," I said. "Then surely you can see that fighting this through the courts will cost you far more than whatever you stand to gain. We're trying to be reasonable." "I appreciate that," I said. "My attorney will be in touch." I ended the call and sat in the quiet kitchen, Harold's diary open on the table in front of me. Not to any particular entry, just open, the way you might keep a trusted friend nearby when the atmosphere grows heavy. The clarity I had found at the lake had not left me. If anything, their offer had reinforced it. You don't offer someone $75,000 for something worth nothing. It was during these weeks that I found, somewhat unexpectedly, that I was not as alone as I had felt. The first person was Ray Perkins, who had begun showing up at the property even on days when there was no scheduled work. Sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing but the steady company of a man who had lived in this county his entire life and felt, in some quiet way, that something unjust was being attempted. Ray had known Harold, not well, he said, but well enough. He used to lock up tight whenever Gerald came around, Ray told me one morning over coffee on the porch. Shut all the blinds. Gerald would park out front for an hour sometimes, and Harold just wouldn't answer the door. I wrote that down. Diane would want it. The second person was a woman named Ellen Marsh, a retired school teacher who lived 3 miles down the road and had been Harold's closest neighbor for 30 years. She heard about my situation through what I can only describe as the efficient information network of rural Ohio, some combination of the diner, the post office, and the Lutheran church, and she appeared at my door one Saturday with a casserole and a clear sense of purpose. Harold told me once that he had made arrangements, she said. He didn't say what arrangements. I always assumed he meant a will, but he was very specific about one thing. He said, whatever happens to this place, he hoped it would go to someone who deserved it. Did he say that often? He said it every time Gerald Whitmore's name came up, she said. Ellen became, over the following weeks, something I hadn't realized I needed. A witness. Not a legal witness, not yet, but a human one. Someone who had known Harold, who could speak to his character, his intentions, his fears. Diane added her name to the list of people we might call on. I also joined an online forum during those weeks, a small community of people who had made unexpected finds on purchased properties. A woman in Kentucky had found antique gold coins beneath a floorboard. A man in Georgia had discovered Depression-era savings bonds. Their collective wisdom, offered freely and without judgment, helped me understand that what I was facing was unusual, but not unprecedented. I was building something, carefully and quietly, a foundation, and from somewhere across the county I knew that Gerald and Pamela were watching. Let them watch, I thought. I wasn't hiding anything. They came on a Saturday in late June, arriving together in Gerald's black SUV at just past 10 in the morning. I saw them from the upstairs window, where I had been measuring for new trim. I watched them walk up the porch steps, Gerald in a press shirt, Pamela in a linen blazer, both of them wearing the careful, composed expressions of people who have rehearsed their entrance. I could have turned them away at the door. Legally, there was no obligation to speak with them, and Diane had advised me more than once to redirect all contact through counsel. But I opened the door. I had reasons, and they were deliberate ones. I wanted to see what they were prepared to say to my face, and I had already called Diane to let her know they were here and started the voice recorder on my phone. We thought it was time we spoke honestly, Gerald said, without the lawyers getting in the way. Come in, I said. I offered them nothing, no coffee, no invitation to sit. I stood in the center of the kitchen, and they stood near the door, and the three of us regarded each other across the room. Gerald began with what was almost certainly intended as warmth. He talked about Harold, about childhood summers on the farm, about a man who had been private and particular but family nonetheless. He said the word family 4 times in the first 3 minutes, and then gradually his tone shifted. We were blindsided by all of this, he said. You have to understand. We had no idea any of this money existed. And it's difficult to discover that what our uncle accumulated over his entire lifetime might be lost to us because of a technicality in a tax sale. It wasn't a technicality, I said. The property was delinquent on taxes for 6 years. The sale was handled through proper county proceedings. I'm happy to share the documentation. Pamela stepped in then. Her approach was different from her brother's. Softer, more personal, designed to create the impression of shared feeling. We're not here to fight, she said. We're here because we think you're a decent person who found herself in an unexpected situation, and we want to help resolve this fairly for everyone. She paused. I think if you look at this honestly, you can see that what you have belongs to our family. Harold was struggling at the end. He made decisions that didn't always reflect his real wishes. We're asking you, as a human being, to do the right thing. There it was. Harold was struggling. His decisions didn't reflect his real wishes. The gentle suggestion, the same seed Pamela had planted on the porch weeks ago, that Harold's state of mind made the diary unreliable, that his deliberate choices were the confused actions of an aging man who couldn't think straight. I had prepared for this. Harold Whitmore was examined by his physician twice in the last year of his life, I said. His medical records, which are part of the probate documentation we've submitted, show no diagnosis of cognitive impairment. He was assessed as fully competent. Pamela blinked. He was also, I continued, examined by the county court when you filed for guardianship in 2019. The court found no grounds for the appointment. Their ruling is also on record. A long silence. Gerald's composure slipped, very slightly. Just a tightening around the eyes, a shift in his posture. "You've been thorough," he said. "I have," I said. What came next was not exactly a threat. It was more precise than that. Gerald leaned back slightly, and his voice dropped into a lower register. The register of a man who has stopped pretending. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to understand something. We have resources, we have time, and we have a family connection to this property that no court document can erase. We are prepared to pursue every legal avenue available to us. That process will be long, and it will be expensive, and at the end of it, even if you win, you'll have spent years of your life and most of whatever money is left on attorney's fees. Is that really what you want?" I looked at him for a moment. "Thank you for coming," I said. "You know how to reach my attorney." They left. I watched from the porch as the black SUV backed down the driveway and disappeared behind the tree line. The Saturday morning was very quiet after that. Birds, wind through the new leaves, the distant sound of a tractor somewhere across the fields. I went back inside. I sat at the kitchen table. My hands were trembling, just slightly, just barely, and I let them. I was not going to pretend the fear wasn't there. Gerald was right about one thing. This would be long and expensive and exhausting. The uncertainty was real. The risk was real. But so was something else. What I felt sitting in Harold Whitmore's kitchen on that June morning was the particular cold clarity of a woman who's been underestimated enough times to stop being surprised by it. Gerald had looked at me and seen a 44-year-old divorcee who had bought a broken farm for $150 and stumbled into something too large for her. He had calculated that I could be worn down or frightened off. He was wrong. The fear, when I examined it honestly, was not the kind that counsels retreat. It was the kind that sharpens things, the kind that tells you exactly what is at stake and why it matters. I picked up my phone and texted Diane. They came. I recorded the conversation. "Call me when you can." Her response came in under 2 minutes. Good. Very good. The hearing in Morrow County Common Pleas Court was scheduled for a Wednesday in October, nearly 6 months after I had first descended those concrete stairs. The courtroom was small and functional, the kind that handles property disputes and the ordinary bureaucratic conflicts of ordinary lives. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Weller, 63 years old with a reputation in the county for having no patience for theater. Gerald and Pamela arrived with 2 attorneys from Stratton and Burke. I arrived with Diane. The Whitmore argument was, at its core, simple. Harold Whitmore had accumulated funds during his lifetime that should have constituted part of his estate. His estate had passed, by right of in-estate succession, to Gerald and Pamela as his nearest heirs. The tax sale of the property did not, they argued, transfer ownership of personal property that had been concealed within the structure, because concealment was not the same as abandonment, and the estate had never been properly probated before the tax proceedings. It was a reasonable argument. I had spent 6 months understanding exactly why it was wrong. Diane presented our case methodically. She began with the title Documentation, the county tax delinquency proceedings conducted over 6 years with documented notification to all parties of record, including the filing showed a notice sent to Gerald Whitmore as a known relative of the property owner, which Gerald had never acknowledged or acted upon. If he had been so concerned about his uncle's estate, Diane pointed out there had been 6 years and more than adequate legal notice in which to address it. One of the Stratton and Burke attorneys began an objection. Judge Weller raised one hand, and the attorney sat down. Then Diane introduced the diary. She had prepared a certified copy, authenticated by the handwriting analyst, and she walked through it with the precision of someone who had read it many times. She didn't dramatize. She simply read, aloud, in the quiet of that courtroom, the words of a man who had known his family and made his choices accordingly, entry after entry. Harold describing Gerald's visits, his questions about the property's value, his casual references to what happens when you're gone, Uncle. Harold describing Pamela's guardianship filing. She says she only wants to help me. She has filed papers with a court. I have hired my own attorney and the court has dismissed her claim. I am not confused. I am not afraid. But I am no longer willing to pretend I don't know what they want. And then the final entry. Diane read it quietly, without inflection. I have thought about what should happen to this. I have thought about it for a long time. The people who might come with documents and lawyers and claims of blood are not the people I would choose. I hope, whoever finds this, that they are someone who needed it. I hope they have the courage to hold on to it. I leave this to Providence and to the character of whoever opens this door. The courtroom was absolutely silent. I watched Gerald Whitmore's face during that reading. The composed, practiced surface of the man I had met 6 months ago was still mostly in place, but only mostly. There was something working underneath it, a quality I recognized, the expression of someone realizing that the thing they dismissed as manageable is now in the room with them, real and undeniable. Pamela was less controlled. Her hands, folded on the table in front of her, tightened as Diane read until her knuckles were white. The Stratton and Burke attorneys cross-examined Diane's witnesses with technical precision, questioning the handwriting authentication, questioning the timeline of the diary's discovery, questioning whether the diary constituted a legal instrument of any kind. Diane had anticipated all of it. Her answers were patient, complete, and consistent. Then came the moment I had not anticipated. Gerald Whitmore, apparently against the advice of his counsel. I saw the attorney's hand move briefly to his arm, and Gerald ignore it, asked to speak on his own behalf. Judge Weller allowed it. Gerald stood and addressed the court with the easy confidence of a man who had, throughout his life, talked his way through most things. He spoke about family loyalty, the emotional weight of losing an uncle, the injustice of seeing a stranger profit from what should have been a family legacy. He was persuasive. He was genuinely moving in the way of people who have had a great deal of practice. And then he made a mistake. My uncle, he said, in his final years was not always rational. The diary Your Honor has just heard. It reflects the confusion of an elderly man who had isolated himself and developed distorted views of the people who loved him. Judge Weller looked up from her notes. "Mr. Whitmore, are you asserting that your uncle lacked competency?" Gerald hesitated. "I'm saying he wasn't always clear-headed because the court record shows that you did not contest his competency through any legal proceeding in the final years of his life. The guardianship attempt, filed by Ms. Cross in 2019, was dismissed. Are you now asserting that your uncle was incompetent at the time he accumulated and concealed these funds?" Gerald's attorney was on his feet. Gerald was still talking. Pamela had placed her hand on her brother's arm. "If you are asserting incompetency," Judge Weller said, cutting cleanly through the noise, "you need to have raised that argument with proper documentation before today. You cannot introduce a new competency claim in closing remarks." The room had a specific quality to it now, the quality of things having shifted irrevocably in one direction. I sat beside Diane and kept my hands folded on the table and my expression neutral, and I breathed slowly and evenly, and I felt the cold, clean certainty of a woman who had prepared carefully, held on tightly, and refused to be moved. The hearing concluded at 3:47 p.m. Judge Weller said she would issue her ruling within 30 days. I walked out of the courthouse into an October afternoon, cool, bright. The maples along the street fully turned. Diane walked beside me, and neither of us spoke for half a block. Then she said, "Gerald just argued both sides of the same case in front of a judge." "I know," I said. "He told the court Harold was incompetent, which undermines their entire inheritance argument. Because if Harold wasn't competent to manage his affairs, the estate should have been formally administered years ago, which it wasn't, because they never pursued it." "I know," I said again. We looked at each other. "You're going to win this," Diane said. I had believed that for months. Hearing it out loud on a sidewalk in Cardington on a golden October afternoon was something different entirely. Judge Weller's ruling arrived on a Thursday morning, 22 days after the hearing. Diane called at 8:14 a.m. "Read it," I said. I was standing in Harold's kitchen, my kitchen. October light came through the new windows. Outside, Canada geese were crossing the lower field. The ruling was 12 pages. I stood with one hand on the counter and listened. Judge Weller found first that the tax lien sale had been conducted in full compliance with Ohio statutory requirements, including documented notice to Gerald Whitmore, whose awareness of the proceedings foreclosed any claim of improper process. Second, she found that currency deliberately concealed within a structure becomes part of the property rather than separable personal property, particularly when the property has been transferred through lawful proceedings. Third, and this was where I gripped the counter, she addressed the Whitmore inheritance claim directly. The estate of Harold Whitmore had never been formally probated, and Gerald and Pamela had taken no steps to initiate probate in the years between Harold's death and my purchase. The court found insufficient legal basis for their assertion of standing. Fourth, she addressed the diary. Not a legal will, but credible, consistent with the medical and legal record, and reflective of a man of fully intact capacity making considered decisions about his own property. The motion by Gerald Whitmore and Pamela Cross was denied in its entirety. I put the phone down. Then I went outside, stood on the porch, and let the cold October air move over me. $914,000. Mine. Legally, clearly, completely mine. The Whitmores filed for reconsideration. Weller denied it in 4 days. They appealed to the Ohio 5th District Court of Appeals. 6 months later, the appellate court affirmed her ruling, citing the proper execution of the tax sale and the factual record established by the diary. Their attorneys sent a final letter requesting a voluntary contribution. Diane responded in a single paragraph. They did not write again. By June, in 14 months after I had first descended those concrete stairs, the money was in accounts under my name. Legal costs came to $114,700, which left me with $799,500. For the first time in my adult life, I had no mortgage, no debt, no dependence on anyone else's decisions about my future. I had earned it, not by luck alone, but by the willingness to do the right thing when the temptation not to was real, and by the stubbornness to hold on when everything around me was designed to make me let go. I drove out to the Cardington Lutheran churchyard and found Harold Whitmore's headstone, modest gray granite, the single word farmer beneath his name. I held on, I said. The breeze moved through the cemetery trees. I took that as an answer. The renovation of the farmhouse took 8 months, and it was the most satisfying work I had ever done in my life. I restored the original woodwork, rebuilt the wide porch, kept the oak floors refinished rather than replaced. The kitchen was redesigned with care and respect for what the house had always been. I added a small guest suite above the old milk room that I quietly thought of as Harold's room. The farm began to work again. I leased 6 acres to a young couple named Beck and Carla Renner. I planted a kitchen garden, added 12 lay-in hens, and started a blog about the restoration that grew into something people actually read, and eventually into a small book contract, a memoir about the farm, the find, the fight, and what it means to start over at 44. I called it Providence, Harold's word, borrowed with gratitude. Gerald Whitmore and Pamela Cross did not fare as well. Gerald took out a second mortgage to pay his attorneys. By spring, it was delinquent. Pamela filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, listing over $90,000 in legal fees among her debts. Gerald left his sales management position and spent the following year consulting independently, which often means precisely what it sounds like. I did not seek this information. It came to me the way things do in a county where everyone knows everyone. I received it with deliberateness, noting it, understanding it, declining to be defined by it. On the last Sunday of each month, I drove into Cardington, ate breakfast at the diner, left a $20 tip, and drove back along the county road thinking about what it means to be ready when your moment arrives.